in technology entrepreneurship at the Sun School of Engineering, and run a program called Best Virtual Entrepreneurs in Science and Technology. But without further ado, I am actually going to hand over to Eric. I think he's joined us. And Eric is, I'm only going to ask him to explain what the Ecological Footprint Initiative is as in his opening comments. So Eric, welcome. We understand these things happen. Sometimes I try and do 2 lectures at the same time. So welcome. I know you're trying to be in multiple places. We're very pleased to have you here, and please introduce yourself.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for your patience. I'm sorry, it was a presentation to the president and vice presidents of the university, so I kind of, unfortunately, rank had to trump, I guess, in this instance. Otherwise, I would have definitely.
Oh well, you've got the priorities wrong. Students ahead of presidents.
For sure, yes. Well, and especially those who aspire to be prime ministers. So thanks so much for your interest in this topic. So I'm sharing my slides now. I think that is fine for everyone, right? Okay, so title of my presentation is GDP is gross, well-being is better. Some ideas for aspiring prime ministers. So I'm really excited on all of your behalf that you've got this great opportunity in front of you through the scholarship question. If you were the Prime Minister of Canada, what policies and principles would you establish to improve the economy while also enhancing the environment? So I'm going to provide you with some ideas that I hope can be inspiring to you in your answer to this essay question. So I'm going to address it, starting off with focusing on policies and principles. I have a background in the policy world, so I guess you can call me a bit of a policy wonk. And I am also an economist as well. And so when I think about policies and principles, I approach this from sort of an economics perspective to think about metrics as well. And sort of metrics being sort of that interface between policies and principles. You've probably heard, I'm sure, various sayings like, it's hard to manage things you don't measure, or what gets measured gets managed. And so all of that relates to being impressed with the fundamental that when we're engaged in expressing policies to, let's say, improve upon things we want more of, to reduce those things we want less of, it's very important to be able to measure those things. And so it's the measures that kind of are the interface between, I would say, principles of sort of having some good sense of what there should be more of, what there should be less of, what we should be concerned about, what we should be less concerned about, etc. And policies, which is how to improve upon those things, what to do about those things. So in this context, then, I'd like to then focus my presentation to you about metrics, which I think are important but underappreciated. And so hopefully this will make a good impression upon you. So, and a really important question I think that everyone should ask and answer, especially those aspiring to be prime minister or anyone in the political realm or the public policy realm, is what should we aim to maximize or minimize? And so in thinking about this question, the default answer in Canada over many years and many different parties in power, I would say, is when in doubt, maximize gross domestic product, or GDP. And if we maximize gross domestic production, that is typically the goal within budgets going back, at least for the last 10, 15 years or so that I've been reading federal and provincial budgets. When you look at speeches from the throne, you look at campaign literature and so on. In Canada, there is so much of this sort of deferring to this presumption that, well, when in doubt, maximize gross domestic production. Now, here's a few challenges associated with that. So gross domestic product, or all the gross domestic production that gets measured by the metric of GDP, reflects all of the goods and services that are produced, measured in monetary terms within a period of time in Canada, including the exports from Canada and subtracting the imports into that. So it's a very limited metric. It's useful for some purposes, but over the years, it's taken on much more importance than I think is relevant. Gross domestic production includes regrettables. There are things that we produce which we'd rather not have to produce, but we produce them in a sort of regrettable way. And so we obviously would want to maximize those components, so we should be a bit cautious about wanting to maximize everything that goes into this. The other thing too is that gross domestic product, that measure of gross domestic production, omits a lot of things that are very important to all of us, but yet is not transacted through the market economy. Production that takes place outside the market economy, also production that takes place from nature that benefits us directly as humans, but are not transacted as commodities. We have to be mindful, especially at this point in time in the 21st century, that every transaction in the marketplace tends to have also what are called negative externalities associated with that. So when you and I transact over something, if I'm a producer and you're a consumer of that thing, very often in the sort of supply chain and my own activities, I end up generating wastes that pass a cost on to others that are not fully captured by the prices that I might pay as a producer or that you might pay as a consumer. And so when we start piecing all this together, and note that gross domestic production is an aggregate amount of production that does not necessarily reflect sort of a broad-based sort of equal opportunity to engage in that production and the income that relates to it, and so on. Plus, gross domestic production doesn't relate to any kind of measurement of whether we're producing things in a sustainable way or not. We might actually be drawing down the built assets that we have, the natural assets that we have, even the human assets as well. That's why GDP has the word G for gross, it's not net, so it's gross, so it can also be drawing down the capital stocks in the process of production. For all these purposes, I think we should be very uninspired by GDP or gross domestic production as something to maximize as the default go-to, which has so been the tradition in Canada. So if that's the case, then what should we aspire to? What should we be excited about maximizing or minimizing in its place? And so I think that one of the things that we could think about from a metric perspective is to maximize this ratio of human well-being in the denominator. After all, I think as humans, I think surely we would all agree that human well-being is virtuous and we want to have more of it. With, in the denominator of this ratio, the human metabolism of ecosystems. After all, to the extent that we can achieve human well-being by being more economizing and more efficient on our metabolism of the goods and services that flow from ecosystems, then all the better. And if we put this into a ratio, then that, I think, helps to clarify a little bit of the things that we should be aiming for. Now, we can go further than this. This is just the concept. This is sort of the principle. But through metrics, we can get down into policies that we think about achieving this. And so I've further refined this ratio, being much more specific about things that actually have been measured and can be forecast into the future and can be integrated into policies as goals, into policies as options, into reporting on progress or lack thereof in meeting those. So I would say that we can reformulate this, this ratio as we want to maximize in the numerator long lives, equitably lived with high life satisfaction, with the minimization of ecological footprint. So you maximize that ratio. That involves having less of the numerator, more of the denominator. And we want to do this subject to sustaining biocapacity. Biocapacity is the capacity of lands and waters across the planet to support us and all of our metabolism. There's a lot of us, we're very hungry, we occupy lots of space, but the good news is that nature is also immensely productive, even if we don't capture that in our typical economic accounts. But the limitation is that nature is not limitless with its potential to sustain all of our productive activities and so on. And I'll show you some metrics about that shortly. So just focusing on this then, let's start off with the concept of high life satisfaction, because I think that's something that ought to inspire a lot more of us in Canada than typically has been the case, especially since a lot of great research on life satisfaction is coming out of the great work of Canadian academics. It's in the same way of ecological footprint research as well. It's sort of very fitting in Canada. We often tend to draw less upon our own scholarship than the rest of the world draws from Canadian scholarship there. And so I'd like to profile a few of these things here. So in terms of life satisfaction, there's various ways to quantify that. And one of the things that excites me is not just objective measures of life satisfaction derived by sort of experts and policy wonks associated, like if there's more of this, then that's good for people. If there's less of these ailments and impairments, then that's also better for people and so on. But it's also to draw on subjective measures where people are actually asked what your life satisfaction is on a 10-point scale. Canadians and people from across the planet have been asked this question over time, over a very long period of time, and great researchers have integrated the data and are presenting it to us in the world in various ways, including through the work of the World Happiness Report. So they have a new report coming out, which is in just a few days, but I'll just reflect upon their report from last year. So this is a measure of national average self-reported life satisfaction over the period of 2018 to 2020, going from the top countries down the list. And so Canada is in 14th place with the average to the question of overall, if you think of sort of your quality of life on a 10-point scale, you know, on what sort of step would you fit? The average answer to a question something like that in Canada is about 7.1, whereas the average is 7.8 in Finland. Now, it's interesting not just the average of these numbers, but also the distribution. And also what's amazing that these researchers have done too is they've also statistically related the average answers to this to various determinants of self-reported life satisfaction. And that's what they do by coloring the various bars here. And so from this in Canada, this first smaller portion of the bar is explained by GDP per capita. So that relates to the goods and services and the material standard of living and so on that we have on average here in Canada. So much more is explained by the social support that we have or we don't have that impairs our well-being, our healthy life expectancy, our freedom to make life choices, the generosity that exists that we notice in our various life circumstances, and the extent to which we don't perceive there to be widespread corruption. We're so fortunate to be living in this part of the world where there's a very high answer to life satisfaction questions, being in this case, 14th in the world. There's a lot of places in the world that have higher perceptions of corruption, less generosity, less social support, less healthy life expectancy, and so on. This is something that we should pay attention to, and we should be thinking about policies that can enhance this. And we should be challenging ourselves and all the policymakers that might be doing their work to come before the Prime Minister and the Cabinet when they're proposing various things to do, to ask the question of how is this going to affect life satisfaction in the future. And so, so that's where Canada stands at this point. Now, as Prime Minister, you'll need better measures and reporting on well-being. If you go to Statistics Canada, you click on data and you type in life satisfaction, you'll get no answers there. If you type in well-being, you won't get very much there either. Whereas, for example, in the United Kingdom, if you go to their Office of National Statistics, you go on data, you go to well-being or life satisfaction, wow, there's all kinds of information available, for example, on how people's life satisfaction and well-being has been impacted during the COVID period, the widespread degree of loneliness experienced by so many people in the United Kingdom, et cetera, which has triggered all kinds of policy responses in the United Kingdom and so on. So for all of you who are aspiring to be a Prime Minister or answering that essay question, be mindful that it's not just paying attention to better metrics, but also making sure that you have as a goal to improve the capacity in Canada to collect and report upon these metrics for you and for Cabinet and for the broad public and so on. So going back to this ratio, let's look at ecological footprint subject to sustaining biocapacity. So this is an area of work and research. It's very close to what I do. I'm going to draw on the work that I've been doing with students at York University in the Ecological Footprint Initiative. So we generate metrics on ecological footprint and biocapacity for the planet and for countries from the 1960s to the present. And I'll share with you some bits of information about that. So the ecological footprint is the area needed to sustain our consumption of food, not just directly consumed by us, but also of our pets and animals, plus the area needed to provide us with fibers that we use, including in clothing and so on, plus the renewable building materials, including, let's say, wood, and also the materials related to that, including pulp, paper, cardboard, all that sort of stuff, plus the area needed to accommodate all of our settlements and infrastructure across the planet, plus the area needed to metabolize all the waste greenhouse gas emissions that we emit as humans into the atmosphere. When you put it all together, we define this into various components of ecological footprint: fishing grounds, built-up land, cropland, grazing lands, forest products, and forest carbon uptake, which is the area of forest land needed to sequester the emissions that are in excess of what were absorbed by the world's oceans. And so all this together, these components are summable, and they're quantified as ecological footprint, and that defines the area of land and water needed to sustain our consumption of renewable resources, settlements, and carbon emissions. This can be compared to biocapacity, the area available to sustain us on a planetary basis or even on a national basis or regional basis and so on. We have it in similar components, so we can make equivalencies and comparisons between them. We have them in the same units, which allow comparisons also over time and across the whole planet, so you can compare in Canada to any other part of the world in units of global hectares, which are national hectares that are converted to global hectares in terms of equivalent levels of productivity. So here's a chart of the ecological footprint divided by biocapacity from 1961 to 2018. By all the components that I just showed with you before. Now, this is a ratio. So how much footprint divided by how much biocapacity in each of these years? So in every year since 1970, that ratio is in excess of 1. That means that we've been in periods of global overshoot, where the ecological footprint of humanity's consumption has been in excess of biocapacity. Now, this reflects on us being, there's a lot of us, and we metabolize a lot of goods and services from nature in excess of the rate by which nature can regenerate the flows of materials and energy and can draw down the emissions that we emit. When we think ahead to the future, let's say to 2050, Canada is one of 120 countries that have signed on to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Net zero emissions means that in 2050, every bit of carbon that we emit as humans into the atmosphere in that year would be drawn down by processes in that same year. So on a net basis, we would not be adding any more to the stock of carbon in the atmosphere, which you've been adding to for quite some time. So from a footprint perspective, essentially this means getting to a target of the ecological footprint being within the realm of biocapacity. And so the obvious question is the pathway of how to get from here to there. But it helps with this directionality to have this as a goal to reduce our ecological footprint on a planetary basis. And of course, Canada is a good portion of that as well, to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And so, of course, the planet can not only provide us with biofuels as a substitute for fossil fuels, it can also provide us with areas that could be afforested, etc. But when we put all these potential ideas together, we have to realize that all these are competing for different amounts of land and water. And so it's helpful to have an accounting system like this to put it all together in units of area to help understand what the possibilities and constraints are, because not only do we want to draw down all the carbon emissions in that year, we also want to feed ourselves, we also want to accommodate our buildings and infrastructure and so on during that time period. And we think about this too, here's the added challenge, is that after past economic crises that the world has faced, the world has, after the crisis has waned, the recovery has tended to be very metabolic in nature. It's tended to lead to a rebound in the increase in ecological footprint. And clearly that needs to not happen in the future for us to start reducing that to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, in the Canadian context, it's all the more important for Canada to pay attention to this and to figure out our accounting, our pathway, our policies, metrics, and so on in pursuit of net zero emissions by 2050. This is a graph of the amount of ecological footprint it takes to generate $1 million worth of exports versus $1 million of imports to Canada over time. And you can see throughout all of these years, Canada exports more footprint intensive stuff than it imports. Essentially, we export lots of wood and pulp and raw resources and so on. And then in exchange, we import a lot of intellectual property, patents on software and medicines, and a lot of entertainment like Netflix and so on. And so when we think about it from a trade and competitiveness perspective, as for all of you emerging wanting to be a prime minister and think about public policy, it's important to think, especially for Canada, about yielding more value out of less metabolism of the lands and waters in Canada to close this gap and to reduce this over time as well. So as Prime Minister, your government will need better measures of natural wealth. It's important when we're thinking about wealth to not just measure the buildings and the intellectual property that we've built and so on, but also think about natural wealth, natural capital, natural infrastructure, green infrastructure. There's various names for this, but they all sort of refer to the same thing of natural wealth. And in that regard, Canada really has to do better. You as a Prime Minister, you're going to want to demand that Statistics Canada and other researchers are going to be able to equip you with better measures of natural wealth. Right now, Canada includes on its national balance sheets of all assets, it includes some aspects of natural wealth, but what it does is it includes the value of timber resources that haven't yet been consumed, and the value of coal that is possibly mineable, but yet hasn't been mined, plus oil, plus minerals, and so on. And when we think about things, especially like coal in Canada, that's something that very soon is no longer going to be an asset, but likely a stranded asset as we're trying to get to net zero emissions in Canada and around the world too. So you're going to need much better measures of that. So think again about making room in your policy proposals to have better collection and provision of information in that. So going back to this ratio again, let's look at long lives equitably lived as the sort of the final component to round this out. So this is exciting, but also a little bit challenging to quantify, but it's possible. And I'd like to share with you some metrics about that. So when we think about equity in the distribution of things, if we think at a very high level, we could think about the distribution of the means to do things, to achieve things, the chances, and the outcomes. And so if we think about that, that all relates to various measures that might relate to economic measures and health measures and so on. But I would just think that we start from this idea of resilience, and that's sort of related to wealth, related to health, and then also related to income as well. Now, it's the case that in Canada and around the world, we tend to put more effort into measuring the distribution of income than we do on the distribution of wealth, and possibly in many cases the distribution of health outcomes. And also we haven't quite yet turned ourselves to the concept of resilience and how to measure that and so on. But nevertheless, even with information about income, it's still, we can still derive some very important sort of conclusions from that and suggestions for the future. So when we think about resilience, obviously at this point, if you're writing an essay to aspire to be prime minister, obviously COVID and the recovery from the COVID pandemic and the consequences of lockdown, limitations, distancing, and so on, obviously that's going to be top of your mind. It's on top of everyone's mind. In that realm, when we're thinking about the equitable enjoyment of life satisfaction, here's a graph of the percentages of Canadians by age group reporting excellent or very good mental health during the COVID period in light blue as compared to the time period before COVID. Now, what's striking about this is just the differences that the COVID pandemic has had on an age-specific basis, where it's affected younger Canadians much more so than older Canadians. Maybe you've already felt that. I don't need to impress this upon you with Stats Canada data, but it's important to be thinking about sort of the distribution on many lines, not just by age, but there's other aspects of distribution. And even just within the same age group, when we start looking at other aspects of attributes of the people within that same age cohort, we can go further to appreciate that the consequences of the pandemic have been concentrated. They've not been equally felt, even if all of us have had sort of some degree of obviously impairment of life satisfaction related to the consequences there. So now what's challenging with all of this is that when our health is impaired, the extent to which we're resilient or not is highly mediated by economic factors related to income and economic wealth. I'll just show you a graph here. This is the age standardized mortality rates for selected causes by income quintile. So this is where, when you look at various illnesses that can cause death, and if you look at the incidence of death on an income quintile basis, that's where you take all of all Canadians, you arrange them on a spectrum from the smallest amount of income to the most amount of income, and then you divide that spectrum into 5 pieces, into quintiles. Then the first quintile is the one with the lowest income, and so on. And so in this case, for all of these, those in the lower income quintile are more likely to die from these various ailments. So not surprisingly then, the distribution of the economic means affects the health means, affects resilience, and so on. So when you think about just the distribution of income, which is something that we do think about, we have a lot of data on that. We have more data than the distribution of wealth. I'd like to profile a little bit of data in this regard. So previous crises have increased income inequalities, and there's ways of measuring this. And this is a plot of the Gini index of market income in Canada. Now, the Gini index is an index of the dispersion of something away from its level of equality amongst people. So the higher the Gini index, the less equal, the higher degree of inequality, as compared to that absolute bottom basis would be 0. If the Gini index is 0, there'd be no inequality in the distribution of whatever thing being measured, in this case being income. Throughout all these past crises that we've experienced in Canada, economic crises, they've generated an increase in income inequality that's been very slow to recover. And it hasn't recovered. I was born in 1978, so Canada has, in every year since then, had a higher degree of income inequality than it did in 1978. So when we think about this, we should be thinking about the distribution of income as something that should be on our mind economically and also environmentally as well. Now, this is the distribution of, in each of the years. I'd like to profile some information about the distribution at points in time affecting the distribution over time through generations. And this is some great research done by Miles Korak. I think this research was when he was at the University of Ottawa. And this is looking at the intergenerational earnings elasticity. And the inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient. So for jurisdictions that have a higher Gini coefficient of income, higher degree of income inequality, and currently, they also correlate with less social mobility, meaning that in these jurisdictions that have a higher degree of inequality of income today, also, they have a higher chance that the amount of income that you earn in your life is more dependent upon your parents' income than just by your own choices and entrepreneurship opportunities and that sort of thing. And so this is a bit concerning because this means that there can be a lasting effect where you can have through the generations, there being less mobility through the income spectrum. So you can be either born into constraints of being low on the income scale or born onto being higher on the income scale, and there'd be less movement, less people rising up the scale, less people falling down the scale.
So Eric, can I just,
yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm just not used to normally better is top right-hand corner, but in this case, it seems like better is bottom left-hand corner.
Yes. Well, better in the sense of less income inequality associated with more social mobility.
So, I mean, if we assume that social mobility is good, then bottom left is good.
Yes, yes. And so what this is saying is that in Canada, about 20% of our income, of my income, is statistically determined by my father's income. Now, and I'm using my father's income because in this case, this graph is looking at the income of the father, because over time and through the generations, they've tended to earn a greater share of the household income. I'm not disputing that's not the case nowadays and changing, et cetera, but that's the artifact of this statistic, and that's why I mentioned that. Whereas, for example, in the United States, it's about 50% of your income is sort of explained by your father's income. Now, Statistics Canada has had some interest in this more recently, in part because Miles Korak's work has been taken up a fair bit. And here's an interesting, relatively more recent
Sorry, can I just, I'm sorry, but I mean, we can come back to big questions at the end, but charts that really challenged me. We're talking about, you keep mentioning father's income, but obviously there's family income. So if your mother and father both earn money, how does that show up on this chart?
So this is not that chart because this is showing the chart through the lineage of the father's income, but Miles Korak has done it on the basis of household income, which if you go back through generations, is not too great of an extent, but if you look at it now and in the last couple of decades, obviously that's very much more important because it's you're less likely nowadays to have both parents being still within the family and so on. It kind of relates to what I'll show you on the next version of this.
So basically there's more other charts that have household income rather than just father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and it still shows similar relationships where the inequality in the current time period seems to be very much related to that amount through the generations. So this is interesting. This is some more recent work that Statistics Canada published looking at different birth cohorts. So the extent to which, so in this case, for example, if you were born in 1982, you were born into a Canada that had a higher degree of income inequality than those who were born in 1963. Also, if you're born in 1982, a higher portion of your income prospects are determined based upon your parents' income prospects than was the case for those who were born in 1963. So there seems to be this trend in Canada of not just growing income inequality, but also a reduction in social mobility over time. So yeah, something to think about there because there can be these lasting effects there. So a few things to round out my presentation. So one is that employment relates to distribution, not just production, or affects it as well. And so that's why when we're thinking about the distribution of income, we also have to be thinking about the distribution of opportunities related to employment and the potential to improve upon the the opportunities of employment and various employment-oriented policies and so on, which I'll reflect on more in a few minutes. The other thing is the tax system is very powerful. And I'm sure many of you who want to aspire to be prime minister are aware of this. And I would just say that reform is scary, but also necessary too. And I'm sure, I hope many of you will have great ideas on reforming the tax system. The tax system is a broad system. So within that, we're reflecting on things like, not just taxation of personal income or household income versus, let's say, corporate versus also related tax of consumption versus income, about wealth versus income, and so on. And this is really important from an environment and economy perspective because the tax system is so powerful. There's great potential to use it to try to integrate goals that are economic and environmental in nature so that we can achieve success on both fronts. And so Canada is doing that incrementally, very timidly, through things like carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is where you're either directly taxing each emission of carbon or you're mandating that each emission of carbon has to be accounted for through some kind of a cap and trade system, which has an equivalent effect on the price of burning fossil fuels or the price of using them in the production of things that that are sourced from fossil fuels. In both cases, then it's a great opportunity, and to do more of that at the same time of also reforming the broader tax system with regards to distributional equity as well, because Canadians and all humans are very oriented towards not just themselves, but to others. They're very attentive to fairness and concepts of justice. And so it's really powerful to integrate all these things together rather than trying to do it on a piecemeal basis on something for the environment, something for the market economy, and so on. Prices are powerful as well, and imperfect and affected by policy. As I mentioned, the prices that we pay for everything are incomplete. They're imperfect because in the process of producing various things, in the process of consuming various things, we don't pay for all the consequences from that in terms of the pollution, the waste products that might go into the air, the waste noise, the waste aesthetics, and everything else too that goes along with that. That's very important to all of us who have an interest in the environment and economics. And so, yeah, very important to pay attention to that and to think about policies that purposefully affect prices so they can be sending a better signal to the marketplace for everyone who's in the business of producing things, everyone who's busy consuming things and planning for the future, to be able to do so in a way that integrates economic and environmental conditions. So with that, just to conclude then, we need a broader support system that directly supports people. There's a lot of talk about basic income. I suspect many of you who are aspiring to be prime minister are thinking about basic income. If you're thinking about it, think about designing it in such the way that it flows quickly and is very responsive. But at the same time, I would say also think about other basics to round that out. Think about basic jobs that are plentiful and meaningful. In the same way that our Bank of Canada acts as a lender of last resort to the financial system, surely you can also act as a sort of a lender of last resort for an employer of last resort policy that, let's say, might be the federal power of the Treasury backstopping, let's say, employment through the non-for-profit and charitable sectors across the country to increase the supply of jobs, especially in recessionary times, but on an ongoing basis. So that's much easier for all of you, especially if you haven't been in the workforce very much, to be able to get a foothold into the workforce, because that's so affecting people's sense of connection, of purpose, of income, and so on. Also about basic provisions of basic goods and services, because it's not just the income that you can purchase this stuff with, but in many cases, it's sometimes more efficient to provide actually the provision of something like health insurance directly rather than providing you with an amount of money that you can use to buy your own health insurance. And so on. There's opportunities for basic wealth through common asset trust, especially related to natural assets, and so on. And I would just say we should be a bit skeptical about indirect supports flowing from stimulus. Very often stimulus is meant to be channeled through the corporate sector, or let's say if there's a challenge, let's say in the forestry sector, the response is to rescue a forest company or the forest sector. I would say it's better to flow that through rescuing those who are affected by the loss of income or the loss of jobs or opportunities there, and then have them be the ones to support through as investors into forest companies if the forest companies are proposing, let's say, new investment opportunities to try to retrofit them so they can be more efficient for the recovery and so on. So with all that, I'll just conclude that there are lots of economists, there's lots of brands of economics. I hope you would appreciate that as Prime Minister, you'll have a role in choosing various people to provide you with advice, to you and your government and cabinet and so on. And when you're doing so, be sure to draw from the diversity within the economics community, especially those who do ecological economics, such as myself. Ecological economics is interested in sustainability, which is about the stewardship of human-built and natural assets. It's interested in economic efficiency, which is about getting the most from using the least. It's interested in distribution and focus on integrating the consideration of distribution into economic analysis regarding the means, chances, and the outcomes. And it's important to think about all these things together because it's the case that just because you have something that might be efficient is not necessarily sustainable, or sustainable things might not necessarily be efficient or just. So it's important to think about all these things together because very often your policy packages should be a package that act upon these various dimensions concurrently. So with that, I wish you all the best as you're thinking about the rather gloomy, gray, and hard surfaces in the streets that we have today to envision a much more sort of prosperous and enjoyable future that integrates the environment and the economy for very purposeful outcomes of long lives, equitably lived with high life satisfaction with a minimum of ecological footprint. That's my pitch. Thanks so much for your interest.
So Eric, are you okay to have some questions? Do you have time? You don't have to go and do another presentation somewhere else? No,
I'm good.
Okay. So first of all, I really want to thank you. This was very stimulating. I mean, I could have you keep questions like for 20 more sessions, but I know we only have a limited time. So I will, of course, ask anybody that's on the webinar to post the questions in the chat. One question I have, you know, being a professor of tech entrepreneurship, and very interested in sustainability and the economy in general, I always find that there's this dilemma between wealth creation and how you spend the money. In other words, wealth distribution. And sometimes they seem disconnected, sometimes they seem connected. Have you thoughts on how, you know, policies that are going to both stimulate wealth creation? I mean, I think there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time thinking about how we can distribute wealth that other people are creating. But if we don't create the wealth in the first place, then, you know, we just have a lower standard of living. So have you thoughts on that? I'm sure you do, but I mean.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I do. And I think it's important for everyone to have great thoughts on that. And so there's a couple of thoughts I can offer. So one is that, one is the starting point, I guess, about our assumptions of the average human that we're targeting through policies and principles and so on. And I would say the average human is very interested in wealth creation, even creating wealth that is not even monetizable. People contribute a lot to the betterment of things, to innovating, to creating, to exploring, to be just curious, and so on. And that's an innate part of humanity. At the same time, too, as it being part of an innate form of our humanity to be very much attentive to others and how others are performing and so on. We create more wealth when we're in the company of others that are doing the same. If we're in the company of others that are not doing that, of those who are, let's say, being antisocial, of being very aggressive, being aggressors, being selfish, not interested in others, and so on, that decreases our interest in contributing to either shared wealth, shared or else even our own internal drives for wealth that can be monetized as well. So I think when we put all that together, then we have to be thinking about the ways by which we want to facilitate and reward the creation of wealth, whether it's monetizable or not, recognizing that monetizable wealth also depends upon the unmonetized wealth of connections, of education, of knowledge, which is a pure public good, and so on. So I think it's really important from a public policy perspective to be mindful of both of those aspects together when we're thinking about all kinds of policies and so on. Now, very often that kind of question then at some point turns to tax policy as well. I have some ideas on that. I'm sure other people have ideas as well. I think when we're focused on the creation of wealth, we should be mindful that our tax system in Canada is so geared towards income and yet not geared towards wealth. And that, I think, is a problem. It's a challenge because we ends up being that too much of the taxation side is on income and not as much on the wealth. We don't actually have a lot of information about wealth. We have a lot of information about income because we actually tax it, so we get information on a yearly basis about it. And I think that relates to the important questions about, for example, the equivalencies between wealth and income, and also income that's earned through, let's say, direct employment. So in other words, T4 income versus income that's earned through things like capital gains, which rely upon others bidding for or demanding something that we're providing in short supply.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. I guess your comment about the culture of if you like, the sharing economy is actually really interesting. I was told by my economics professor that Wikipedia shouldn't exist, on open source software shouldn't exist, because it was getting people to collaborate and work together with no direct compensation. And yet we know that, you know, crowdsourcing and collaboration, certainly in the academic world, is prevalent. But I mean, even now we're seeing it in the economic world. And if you want, I have a paper at the moment on the sharing economy. And one of the things is that it allows people to enter as suppliers who previously could not enter as suppliers. And it provides to users a lower cost and more useful service. So I'm arguing it's a democratizing agent and socially transformative. And so it's kind of interesting that there are some elements around that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And there's great, it's still great potential. I mean, the sort of sharing economy, even if we might sort of engage on, is it a sharing economy? Is it a platform economy? Is it a, what's the right sort of term for that? There's still so much more great potential in that realm that we haven't realized. And especially in regards to various household things. There's been some attempts at doing things like tool libraries and that sort of thing, but they've had sort of the old school approach.
So I was asked by the city, I live in Mississauga, and the head of economic development at the city is a friend of mine from U of T, and she asked me to come and talk about creating the sharing economy in Mississauga. And the idea was, she's doing it from a business point of view, not a personal point of view, that post-COVID, there's lots of people with facilities and resources and technology that they're not using fully because the demand patterns have changed. And how could we make those available to the rest of the community so that everyone is sharing much more? So it is interesting, and I think you're going to see some opportunities arise from that. So I have one more question. I'm going to ask Ali for a question. And what do you think the role of universities is in transforming how people think about some of these issues? Because I mean, you studied economics, you're now in a place where you can do research in economics. I'm still don't understand how economists get jobs, but that's an engineer's talking, not anybody else. But how? And I'm happy for you to answer it in the context of York, but maybe it's a more general comment. What is the role, given that we cannot change the high school system and we cannot change some of the aspects of the social system? How could universities play a bigger role in addressing some of these challenges, particularly if it's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two thoughts come to mind. So one is for universities to think of themselves also as being in the business of informing and exciting and engaging with lifelong learners, not just those who are in a degree program who tend to be at the younger age of of the spectrum of ages in Canada. And especially when we're thinking about sustainability, especially when we're engaged on the green economy, on transformation, on even things like carbon pricing and so on. I mean, these were things that weren't part of degree programs not too long ago, and even still today aren't part of every degree program, but yet there's professionals in the policy world and in the pundit world and everything else who are so keen to learn about this, and there's a great demand for that. So a few years ago, sensing this demand, I partnered with a charity that is well connected to people in the charitable world in that, and then built this curriculum called Economic Literacy for a Green Economy, and then also developed an online version of that as well. And I was able to engage with so many people from across the country in helping them out on that in that regard. And I think that's something where in my own home faculty of environmental and urban change at York, that's something we need to do more of. So it's not just those in degree programs, but you know, that's sort of pure public good stuff for everybody else. And then the other thing that comes to mind is that when you mentioned about like with high school and so on, like the limited role of the university, let's say, and I would also broaden that out to even into the college system as well, is to do better at enhancing the, let's say, the data literacy of people, or the computational literacy of people outside of computer sciences, outside of statistic programs and so on. And that's something that I get really excited about in environmental and urban change, that I help with training people in the program who have no prior experience in coding or in investigating data. And then together we produce those national ecological footprint and biocapacity accounts. We integrate and wrangle 48 million rows of data from all kinds of data sources around the world and so on. And wow, they are just thrilled to be part of that. And it's very intimidating. So not a lot of people sign up for that, but those who do with no prior experience, wow, then everyone else who they've left behind afterwards is like, oh my gosh, I want to be part of that as well. And so I think that's really helpful, because regardless of what program you're in, regardless if you're in economics or engineering or all the other great programs around the world, I think it's important to be able to engage in sort of that degree of sort of literacy, I guess.
Absolutely. And you and I are going to have a conversation about that, because we were asked by Shopify to create a course called Computer Science for Non-Coders. And we launched it in Shopify, and it's going very well. But now they're helping us fund taking it to anybody that wants to learn it. And you know, it's a pilot stage initiative, but I think it's very attractive. I think, you know, I think it's more useful than French, although I probably shouldn't say that. I was Canadian, but no, I think learning coding, it's just a different mindset. And I was lucky because I did it from, you know, day one, but I think it's going to be an increasingly important part of our lives. And I think the other comment to make is I still think the basic university model of a 3 or 4 year degree and then you're done, which is still how we think about it, is completely flawed. It was designed for another time when people go into a career, they'd work there for 30 years and things wouldn't change. And I created an annuity model for education when I was at Temple University, where instead of paying, you know, $50,000 for an MBA, you paid $5,000 a year for lifelong learning. And it was kind of interesting because it's still going, and it makes it more affordable, more accessible. Most companies are happy to pay $5,000 for, you know, education per year when you join a community. But I would love to see that model extended. I'm conscious of time. I'm conscious there's a few other questions. Ali, do you have a question? And then I wanted to go to Charles, has a really interesting question.
Yeah, I want to actually start with Charles' question first.
Okay.
And thank you, Eric, for a very interesting presentation, very insightful. Thank you so much for that. I can read this question from Charles, but I'm sure you also can check it and chat yourself, whichever is best. I can. Please comment on the dilemma for education to balance educating for individual well-being, collective well-being, and the well-being of all life forms. these all often opposing goals and worldviews. I think Charles wants your views on this, which is related to previous question asked by Andrew also. Thank you.
Yeah, I would first I would challenge a little bit the premise that if there are opposing goals and worldviews for those who are interested in individual well-being and collective well-being and well-being for other life forms. From the social science research that I've engaged with and seen, when you have people challenged with trade-offs and questions relating to something individual versus something for the shared versus something for non-human life, there's a tremendous amount of consideration amongst all those things at the same time. And that's what I look to as a very uplifting and exciting part of humanity, that even though that part of humanity might not be the part that gets us excited on all the platforms that we've been sucked into and so on, which broadcast sort of stories of extreme, stories of disinterest, stories of conflict and tension and so on. Humans, when they're faced with trade-offs, let's say between more of something for themselves versus, less of nature, less of species and so on, humans will make tremendous sacrifice for the sake of sustaining species, even species that they don't eat, that they might not even see, that they may not even experience in their lifetime. And that's a lot of the work that we do in the realm of ecological economics, is trying to understand and appreciate the value of the combination of landscapes and biodiversity and species that are beyond any instrumental value even to humans. And then with regards to the trade-off between the self and the community, great research been done sort of worldwide on understanding what those trade-offs are and how humans react to people who are not sharing, let's say, something, or taking too much, or not reciprocating to others and so on. And anyways, great research that's available on that, which concludes across human cultures, across the planet, across time, humans are very interested in the self and others at the same time. That involves dilemmas, of course. But humans, by and large, will reject outright selfishness, and they'll also rightfully want to reject only altruism as well, because both of those extremes can be detrimental to the species. We as a species have evolved such that more collaborative groups succeed, even if more selfish individuals might try to gain an advantage within those. So that's what I would say in response there, Charles, to your comment. I hope that's helpful. If you're interested in some of those more specific elements of research, you can follow up and we can engage on that.
Thank you so much. I have a short question. I mean, the question is short, but I'm not sure about the answer. And that's about, you brought in the concept of resilience into your discussion. And because I'm also working, and I think Andrew also works on resilience concept I'm more in disaster and emergency management. But it was interesting how you brought this into this issue of economy, inequality, etc., and how that is really an important concept in this spectrum. I just need to see kind of elaboration on that, how you integrate this or how you view this into this formula. Really interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's still like an emerging area that I'm thinking about. So I don't really have a super cool answer to your comment, other than I think it's something that a lot more of us should be thinking about, how to codify that, or what is that mixture of things that that sort of relate to resilience. It's a wicked question. I know some jurisdictions have even hired people with a title of resilience, like City of Toronto hired a chief resilience officer, which is kind of intriguing. Like, okay, what do you do as a chief resilience officer? How do you define resilience and so on? And I mean, I think it's still a bit more of an emerging frontier than one that's as established, but I think to me, it's the sort of the next frontier in the realm of sort of well-being research, is sort of understanding that. And in a way, it's sort of expressing resilience as being the ability to, let's say, bounce back from significant stressors that could potentially sort of derail one's chart of life satisfaction. And also it relates to strategies as part of the good life to build in resilience as sort of like an insurance mechanism in the event of failures. I mean, very often resiliency does relate to our connections to others, drawing upon others to help in support, and also being available to support others as well. But it also does relate to, of course, even individual economic circumstances outside the household, or in the cases where you're your own single household, you know, in that sense too. So anyways.
Thank you so much.
You know, I think it's interesting, partly from my discussions with Ali, but partly from a research project we did a couple of years ago. We in entrepreneurship, we teach people to expect failure. In fact, by the way, most entrepreneurship professors don't. But the reality is, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you'll fail 2/3 of the time. And innovation involves failure by its nature. If you're going to do something, sometimes you'll fail. And the secret is learning from failure and stopping before you get into too much trouble, which requires a different mentality and approach than the traditional way. How do you deal with setbacks, etc.? And so we kind of come from the resilience as a psychological construct more than the ability of a city to manage a disaster. But then the interesting thing that came out from that research was the idea that if you could have platforms that do sharing, then when you have a setback, you can use that platform to manage things. And so, for example, we've seen different ride-sharing platforms used for scheduling ambulances during COVID, you know, and meal deliveries during COVID that are not paid Uber Eats ones, but just so it's interesting to see this balance and this overlap between how we prepare for different circumstances and how we prepare and how we build a sense of well-being. I honestly think there's a lot more conversation here. I think that I really want to thank you. I think that just to kind of go back on one thing, Eric, which I think you and I talked about before, this whole series was stimulated by Frank Stronach suggesting that universities are actually the place where we should be addressing these issues. They were kind of saying that politicians can't, because politicians are about winning votes at the next election and they have to do short-term things that maybe don't make any sense. But universities have a bigger role to play, and his challenge to us at York was, how can we do that at York? So the speaker series was one effort. We're trying to do some of it. Ali's trying to do some of it. I know that your dean and a bunch of people, environmental studies and urban change, are also part of that agenda. So I'm looking forward to ongoing discussions at two levels. You know, the strategic advice discussion, how we can provide insights to third parties, politicians, governments, local cities, individuals, about how they can manage themselves, but also how York can be a kind of beacon. I think we used the word lighthouse in another context for this discussion and action to try to pilot some of these things at York. And I think the project you're doing is one that's really interesting in that area. I think Ali's doing some as well. I am. I think they will transform the role of universities over time. And I think York is a great place to do that, because it's a narrative that needs to go on in a big urban city and needs to go on connected to community and academia and be relevant. So I want to thank you so much. So any final thoughts or questions, Ali? Ali, you probably know who's going to be talking next week. I was gonna play we have a great intro video for you, Eric, but we played it before you came on, so I'll send it you as a link.
Great. Again, thanks for the opportunity. And for anyone online, if you want to connect with me individually, it's ewmiller@yorku.ca is how you can get in touch with me. Same thing with any of you watching the recording of this afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So looking forward to our next session that is going to be on March 23rd with Steve Cohen and Nelson Switzer, and that's going to be on a realistic transition to environmental sustainability. Looking forward to that, and looking forward to have you in this session also. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating today.
Thanks so much, Eric.